Hey people, it's nice talking. Now this is part 4 of Black History Steve Biko, so here it goes. Perhaps the most significant activities Steve was involved in at this time were attempts to forge some kind of working unity between the various liberation organizations, especially the ANC, the PAC, and the non-European unity movements, NEUM. Steve began his efforts sometimes in the mid-1970s. Malusi, Mapumulwana, and Mapetla Mohapi were especially active in these attempts, and it later emerged that Mohapi had recruited people into the ANC, among them Bridget Mabandla. According to Lindy Wilson, Mapum Lawana and Mapetla were driving from Pretoria to Natal after Mapetla was released from detention in 1975, where they debated the role that the BBC might now play. An idea grew that BBC should explore its potential as a catalyst for uniting the liberation movements. The idea emerged for several different reasons. The logic that BC's involving ideology should develop from psychological unity to political unity. The fact that in spite of the banning, SASO and BBC still had mobility and continued to operate nationally on the ground. The recognition that the ANC and PAC were the established political movements and the BBC will not act as a third force but will endeavour to create a national consciousness involving all existing historical political movements against the common enemy. The idea was shared with a select group of BC leaders, Fami Zani, Tom Manfata, and Kenny Rachidi. Among them, Steve met with banned PAC leader Robert Sobukwe and also Griffiths Mashinje, who was at the time an underground ANC operative. Both were sympathetic to the idea and agreed to speak to their counterparts. When some BC leaders were already moving to the view, the ANC was paramount and that the BBC should act to realize the aims of the Freedom Charter. At a workshop in Mafeking, in May 1976, Dilizi Maji Norman Dubazana, Nokazazana Delamini, and Mafika Pascal Gawala argued against Steve's vision of BBC playing a central role in unifying the movements. There were plans for Steve to meet with ANC leader Oliver Tambo. Harry Nengwekulu, who had left the country after he was banned in March 1973, was tasked with securing a meeting with the leader of the ANC in exile. The plan was for Steve to leave the country for the meeting, perhaps with an invitation from a Western government, but the logistics and security issues proved too difficult and several planned meetings had to be cancelled. According to Mark Gevisser in his biography of Fabo Mbeki, Steve was to meet with Mbeki as well, but the security situation was not conducive. Barney Pityana was also set to meet with Tambo after he left South Africa in 1978. He was to be accompanied by Ben Kawapa to Lusaka for the meeting, which had been arranged by Craig Williamson, purportedly the chief of the International University Exchange IUEF. Pityana and Kawapa met in Lesotho, where they were told that they would meet with Tambo in Lesotho, flying via Bloemfontein. Fortunately for them, however, they suspected a trap had been laid and stayed away. Indeed, the next day, the newspapers, informed by security police, published a story saying the two had been detained, when in fact they never boarded the plane and abandoned the mission. This episode revealed that Craig Williamson was indeed an apartheid spy. In 1977, Steve was made the honorary president of BBC. Mapum Lawana recounts the role Steve was to play in forging a broad movement together with the exile organizations. It is here that you begin the process of looking out to negotiate over organizations. It is here you begin to see the need of having some kind of central figure. That's why we decided to make Steve the honorary president of the BBC. Before that, he had no formal authority. It was all about the charisma and the influence he had as an individual. The state was desperate to prevent relations between the BCM and the exile organizations, as Steve was questioned about supposed contacts when he was detained. This partly explained why Biko was detained so often during the last 2 years of his life. In March 1977, Biko was arrested and once again released. Mapum Lawana was also arrested in March and held for 4 months. Mamphela Ramphele was also banished from Northern Transvaal, now Limpopo. With so many comrades neutralized, the plan for unity talks folded. Steve asked Peter Jones, a BBC activist based in the Western Cape, to travel to King Williamstown to help run the local BBC offices. It was a fateful move. Jones and Steve, in consultation with their colleague, decided to meet Neville Alexander in Cape Town. A trip would end with the pair being detained. The trip to see Neville Alexander. Soon after midnight on the morning of 17th August 1977, Steve and Jonah set out for Cape Town. Steve wanted to meet with Neville Alexander and his BC counterpart in the city. The latter, led by Johnny Issel, had been critical of Steve's meeting with Dick Clark and of economic policies Steve had contemplated. The pair arrived in Cape Town by 10 a.m. and after resting at Jones' home, Steve drove to meet Fikil Bam, who was a close comrade of Alexander. Jones, meanwhile, to see Alexander, who informed him that he could not meet with Biko. When Jones returned, Bam decided that the trio would go to Alexander's house, despite his decision. They drove there and parked in Alexander's yard, while Bam went into the house to convince Alexander to meet with Steve. Alexander was reluctant for several reasons. Both he and Steve were banned and would be a crippling blow to the movement if they were caught and convicted. Also, he was heeding the recommendations of Cape Town's BC activists. He later recalled, "Fix tried every trick in the book to convince me to meet with Steve, but I would not budge. In order to put pressure on me, he said Steve was sitting in the car in the backyard, but I was instructed by my guys not to meet Steve because of problems within the Black consciousness movement in Cape Town. I did not want to be caught in the crossfire." Steve decided to immediately drive back to King Williamstown on the same evening, August 17th. Jones and Steve undertook the 12-hour journey and reached the outskirts of King Williamstown when they were stopped by a police roadblock. They were identified after a heavily disguised Steve, realizing the hopelessness of denial, decided to announce that he was indeed the man the police were looking for. Jones was taken to Algoa Police Station, Steve to Walmer Police Station, both in Port Elizabeth. Jones underwent severe torture over a prolonged period and never saw Steve again. Steve was stripped and manacled for 20 days before he was transferred to the Sandline building in Port Elizabeth, where the security police were based. He was told to remain standing, but he fired his captors and sat down. Infuriated, Captain Siebert manhandled him, but Steve fought back. Steve was badly beaten the night of 6 September and the morning of 7 September. He sustained a brain hemorrhage. Despite his injury, the police kept him shackled to a grill, still naked. When doctors examined him, they yielded to the security police by glossing over Steve's injuries. Dr. Ivor Lang could find nothing wrong with Steve on 7 September. When specialist Dr. Benjamin Tucker examined Steve, he suggested that the badly injured detainee be taken to hospital, but he backed down when police objected. Lang did not object when police said they were driving Steve to Pretoria, 700 kilometers away. This they did on 11 September in the back of a van, with Steve still naked, frothing at the mouth, unable to speak. In Pretoria, a district surgeon examined Steve and tended to him, but it was too late. Alone in his cell, Steve died sometime on the night of 12 September 1977. The reaction to Steve Biko's death. Steve's death was announced and there was outrage from many quarters. The government was at pains to contradict the obvious interpretation of the event. The police had killed Steve. On Wednesday, 14 September, a Rand Daily Mail report read, Mr. Steve Biko, the 30-year-old black leader widely regarded as the founder of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, died in detention on Monday 12th. Mr. Biko, honorary president of the Black People's Convention and the father of 2 small children, is the 20th person to die in police custody in 18 months. Security police custody. The report quoted a statement by the Minister of Justice, Jimmy Kruger, in which the minister presented the government's version of Steve's death, saying that he had been on hunger strike since September, refusing food. Kruger acknowledged that the district surgeon had been called to examine Steve on 7 September because Mr. Biko appeared unwell. The medic, Kruger continued, found nothing wrong with Biko. Kruger continued his account, glossing over the serious injuries Steve sustained while in detention. Later addressing a National Party NP Congress on 14 September, Kruger announced, I am not glad and I'm not sorry about Mr. Biko. It leaves me cold. I can say nothing to you. Any person who dies, I should also be sorry if I die. There was laughter at this last sentence. Kruger went on to justify the detention of Steve, saying that he had been found in possession of pamphlets inciting arson and violence. He proceeded to give a ridiculous and fictitious account of Steve's detention and death. According to Donald Woods, the next day, Kruger implied that Steve had died of hunger strike, but I knew this couldn't be true because Biko had once said he would never take or endanger his own life in detention, and that if he were to die in jail and it was claimed he had hanged or suffocated or starved himself or cut his wrists, I was to know it was a lie. Die Burger, an Afrikaans government-supporting newspaper, presented the government's sentiments regarding the death of the Black Power activist Steve Biko. Concern over detainees' deaths becomes deep dismay when hysterical propaganda against authorities is observed. A vehement campaign is in progress which surpasses all previous protests. The venomous suggestions are of such an extravagant nature that it fills an objective observer with trepidation. The purpose is to discredit the security police. Similarly, the state broadcaster South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, took the government's version as fact and speculated that if Steve had committed suicide, this would have fitted the pattern of many recent detainee suicides. It went on to their critics, the police point out that so far a court of law has never established that the police have been responsible for torturing and killing a single detainee. There was international outrage at Steve's death, with many governments making statements and sending condolences. Donald Woods published a moving portrait of his friend Biko, saying, "In the 3 years I grew to know him, my conviction never wavered that this was the most important political leader in the entire country, and quite simply the greatest man I've ever had the privilege to know." A post-mortem was carried out soon after Steve's death was announced, but the Biko family's pathologist was informed only after the autopsy had begun. Newspaper reported that Steve had sustained brain damage. Woods challenged Kruger about the hunger strike claims and got a reliable tip-off that he, Kruger, had received the coroner's report of Steve's post-mortem that revealed that Steve had died of brain damage, and although that Kruger had his report for more than a week, he had not yet ordered the inquest or corrected his hunger strike story. A nation weeps. Mourners gather to pay their last respects as Steve Biko's body lies in state in his home before the funeral, attended by 20,000 mourners at King Williamstown, November 1977. Steve Biko's funeral on 25th September 1977 was attended by 20,000 people, although the mourners would have numbered many more if police had not turned many away at scores of roadblocks around King Williamstown. Police blocked all the routes into the town, and thousands were turned away by the heavily armed officials. Convoys in the major cities were stopped even before they set out for the funeral. People from the Transvaal who managed to get through had to pass through 7 roadblocks before arriving in King Williamstown. According to Hilda Bernstein, one of the speakers, Dr. Nafato Modlano, who flew from Johannesburg after he was blocked off when attempting to travel by road, said at the funeral that he had watched as black policemen hauled mourners off the buses in Soweto and assaulted them with truncheons. The physician said he had treated 30 of the mourners, some for fractured skulls, and said he had witnesses who would testify that a number of young women were raped. And I want you to remember this little section here. Black cops are the same world over. They don't serve the black public, they serve white supremacy. Yet the authorities could not hide or dampen the significance of the occasion, which was attended by diplomats from 13 Western countries: the United States of America, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Holland, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and the Scandinavian countries. A small number of South Africans also attended, including Woods, his wife Wendy, her brother Peter Bruce, members of the Progressive Federal Party, including Helen Suzman, Zach de Beer, and Alex Borain. And notice how they said Western countries. Brazil is considered white because, again, it practices white supremacy despite its massive black population. The funeral was marked by passionate denunciations of the apartheid regime and became something of a political rally lasting more than 6 hours. Mourners thrust their fists into the air and shouted power when Steve's coffin was lowered into the grave. The inquest. Calls for an inquest were made by many individuals and organizations, and the Minister of Justice eventually relented. The inquest began on 14th November, 2 months after Steve's death, at the Old Synagogue in Pretoria. But already in October, 2 Attorney Generals of the Transvaal and Eastern Cape announced there would be no criminal proceedings related to the findings of the inquest. The inquest sought ostensibly to determine how Steve had died and was presided over by Magistrate Marfinus Prins, with the Deputy Attorney General Klaus von Leers acting as prosecutor to lead the evidence. But Hilda Bernstein, in her booklet number 46, Steve Biko, writes, "This was no ordinary inquest. It was in essence a conspiracy to defeat the ends of justice, a conspiracy in which almost all the witnesses and most of the court officials joined. Their purpose was not to establish the cause of death, but to conceal it, not to cover or discover who might be responsible, but to hide them." Bernstein quoted the impressions of the past president of the British Law Society, Sir David Napoli, who had been invited to observe the inquest by the Association of Law Societies of South Africa. "I may be wrong, but I came away with the clear impression that on such occasion as he, Deputy Attorney General von Leers, intervened, his questions were directed to preserve the position previously taken up. To this end, on occasions he intervened to support the police and doctors, although they were already represented by our counsel." Bernstein goes on to paint the scene. "The inquest was high drama. Never before at an inquest of someone who died in detention have there been television cameras and reporters from so many countries. Every day a crowd of black spectators sang outside the synagogue. Over the next few days, the security policemen, doctors, and pathologists presented their testimonies about the sequence leading up to the death of Biko. In his submission, Attorney General Klaus von Leer said, 'Our respectful submission is that you, the judge, will come to the conclusion that in this particular case there is no positive evidence that the deceased's death was caused by an act or omission of any person.' The judge repeated these words almost verbatim in his final ruling. Although his death was attributed to a prison accident, evidence presented during the 15-day inquest into Biko's death revealed otherwise. During his detention in a Port Elizabeth police cell, he had been chained to a grill at night and left to lie in urine-soaked blankets. He had been stripped naked and kept in leg irons for 48 hours in a cell. A blow in a scuffle with security police led to him suffering brain damage. By the time he was driven naked and manacled in the back of a police van to Pretoria, where he died. 2 years later, a South African Medical and Dental Council disciplinary committee found there was no prima facie case against the 2 doctors who had treated Biko shortly before his death. Dissatisfied doctors seeking another inquiry into the role of the medical authorities who had treated Biko shortly before his death presented a petition to the SAMDC in February 1982, but this was rejected on the grounds that no new evidence had come to light. Biko's death caught the attention of the international community, increasing the pressure on the South African government to abolish its detention policies and calling for an international probe on the cause of his death. Even close allies of South Africa, Britain, and the United States of America expressed deep concern about the death of Biko and added their support to those asking for an international probe. It took 8 years and international pressure before the South African Medical and Dental Council, SAMDC, took disciplinary action. On 30th January 1985, the Pretoria Supreme Court ordered the SAMDC to hold an inquiry into the conduct of the 2 doctors who treated Biko during the 5 days before he died. Judge President of the Transvaal, Justice W.G. Boshoff, said in a landmark judgment that there was prima facie evidence of improper or disgraceful conduct on the part of the Biko doctors in a professional respect. The aftermath. Soon after Steve's death, the state banned 18 organizations on 17th October 1977, the majority of them allied to the BCM. These included SASO, BPC, BCP, and many others. The Christian Institute, led by Reverend Bayers Node, who was also banned, as was Reverend Node himself. Scores of BC activists were banned, and Donald Woods was also served with a banning order. The BCM launched the Azanians People Organization in 1979, but the organization was also banned soon thereafter. By the early 1980s, the Black Consciousness movement was in decline, eclipsed by the re-emergence of the Congress movement, most notably in the shape of the United Democratic Front. Steve's dream of uniting the various liberation organizations never came to fruition. Rather, the Congress movement took the reins of the anti-apartheid struggle, and eventually the ANC became the ruling party of the first democratic elections in 1994. Steve is survived by his wife, Nsiki, and their child, Noko Sinafi. He also has a child, and Samora with Mamfela Ramfele. His son, Noko Sinafi, launched the Steve Biko Foundation, which has become a non-profit organization with a large presence in the Eastern Cape. In 2013, the Institute celebrated the opening of a large community center in Ginsburg in King Williamstown. The foundation promotes debates on current issues and is growing into a valuable resource in Biko's hometown. Former Nelson Mandela paid tribute to Biko in 2002, saying, "Living, he was a spark that lit a veiled fire across South Africa. His message to the youth and students was simple and clear. Black is beautiful. Be proud of your blackness." And with that, he inspired our youth to shed themselves a sense of inferiority they were born into as a result of more than 300 years of white rule. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. This has been the 4th video in part of Steve Biko. I hope you've enjoyed it. Anyway, I'm going to leave my backup channel because I've gotten a warning on this channel. Anyway, please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.